Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on digital mental health technology. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions via Slido at www.slido.com using the event code #DMHTMay25. You may send in your questions relating to the webinar at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Please note that we will not be accepting questions via the GoToWebinar chat function. It is now my pleasure to introduce your first speaker, Holly Cool, Digital Mental Health, MHRA.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon everyone, and welcome on what is Mental Health Awareness Week. So we're delighted to be able to speak to you a little bit more about our recently published guidance. But first I would like to introduce myself and my colleague Frankie to tell you a little bit more about how we've developed this particular piece of work, the other items that we're working on as part of this project, and of course, as you've probably all joined today, to hear more about the deep dive into the guidance itself. So my name's Holly Cool. I'm the Senior Manager for Digital Mental Health here at the MHRA. I'm a registered mental health nurse by background, and I'm leading this Wellcome funded project on the regulation and evaluation of digital mental health technologies, of which we are 2 years into the 3-year project. I'd like to hand over to Frankie.
Hello, nice to be here. And yes, I'm Frankie or Francesca, and the manager in digital mental health technologies, and I'm working with Holly on this project.
Thanks, Frankie. Next slide then, please. So today's agenda and aims are that we're going to give you an overview of the Wellcome funded Digital Mental Health Technologies project for those of you that aren't aware of the work that we're undertaking. We'll give you that summary on the MHRA guidance that we've published, and this is on the digital mental health technologies, device characterisation, regulatory qualification and classification. There will obviously be, as already explained, an opportunity for questions and comments, and we will try our best to answer as many of those as we can as part of this session. And if there are any questions as a result that we aren't able to answer, then we will seek to be able to provide some thematic responses to those if we can. The aim is to ultimately enhance your understanding of the guidance that we have recently published, and we hope that by offering the opportunity to go into a little bit more detail of the guidance in this webinar, that it will give a much more colourful projection of the work that we've actually completed. Next slide then, please. So the project itself, as I've mentioned, is funded by Wellcome. It was a 3-year project that started in May 2023. So as I mentioned, we're well underway with that work. And we are very fortunate to be working in close collaboration with the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. And we're essentially aiming to clarify the regulation and evaluation requirements for digital mental health technologies, or DMHTs, as we will likely continue to refer throughout this presentation. We've been engaging with a wide range of stakeholders throughout this project, and that has ranged from policy, academic, clinical and lived experience expertise. And we have ensured that there is a strong representation of these stakeholders throughout all stages of the development of this guidance, but also in all of the other outputs that we've been producing as part of this project. We have a working group and a project board, of which strong representation of those stakeholders I've mentioned are present, and they have been absolutely pivotal in making sure that the guidance that we produced remains true to the interests of stakeholders. And again, I've mentioned with those with lived experience have also contributed to that guidance development and those other outputs. We've had lots of engagement with international regulators, some of whom I think are joining this webinar, and we have really tried to approach the guidance development in a way that makes sense not only to the UK, but also kind of seeks to harmonise where possible internationally. We've had a lot of conversations with individuals and with groups that are interested in this space and are looking at trying to make sure that where there are gaps in knowledge or areas where we want to try and understand more, that we're seeking those opportunities to do so. And as I've already mentioned, this project is vitally including people with lived experience or living experience of mental health. And the ultimate aim there is to make sure that the outcomes that we are developing and trying to achieve with this project help get the right tools and treatments to those that need it. Next slide then, please. So as I've mentioned, some of the key project stakeholders we have already engaged in. This slide just illustrates a few more that perhaps I haven't quite mentioned yet. So we've worked obviously with internal and external experts for the agency, for the UK, but also internationally. And that's included our own software and AI team, our borderline products team, and those groups that are also involved in the evaluation of technologies across areas such as clinical investigation and post-market surveillance. We, as I mentioned, established a project working group and a project board. And we've had the engagement with stakeholders across the range of those that are likely to assess products in this area. So that includes approved and notified bodies. We've looked at engagement with health innovation networks, but also those that are part of mental health policy teams in the NHS, but also for other organisations that have a vested interest in how these products are assessed and evaluated and ultimately deployed in public healthcare settings, but also on direct-to-consumer platforms as well. We've also spoken with representatives across industry, academia, with healthcare professionals, patients and the public, and as I've already mentioned, those with lived experience are strongly represented throughout the core work of the working group and the project board. Next slide, please. So this slide, albeit a little bit more wordy, I'm afraid, does illustrate some of the key stages of the Welcome projects that map to the product lifecycle of a digital mental health technology, and then consequently what our project outputs are designed to be as a consequence of us looking at those particular stages. What we've tried to do is keep this project very much to a life cycle approach, and we're trying to make sure that we are making sense of the regulatory requirements throughout the product life cycle. So that encompasses the inception of a product and its development through to its evidence generation, and also then through to market access. And as you can see, some of those key elements of the key stages are around some of the aspects that we'll be talking about today. So in defining intended purpose of a product and determining its qualification and classification. I will talk about future outputs of this project as well in the next slides, but this will cover things like the evidence generation and market access stages of a product, in that we're looking at the clinical and economic evidence requirements and post-market surveillance, as well as supporting professional and patient choice. Next slide then, please. So just to give you an overview of some of the outputs that we've completed so far, we do have a project webpage, which you can find on our gov.uk website, and that contains all of the published outputs that we've produced to date. We have a user and public perspectives report that was commissioned, and that was to understand the public perceptions around the risks, benefits and use of these particular digital mental health technologies. And we are undertaking a subsequent piece of work with the market research company around how public and healthcare professionals identify and report adverse events associated with DMHTs. So it's a really good read just to understand kind of how stakeholder groups are understanding what these products can offer. We have published 3 papers. One is a viewpoint article with Lancet Digital Health, a considerations for regulation and evaluation published with Digital Health, and a conceptual framework for digital mental health technologies, which was published in JMIR Mental Health. And all of those were developed with the insights and input of our stakeholders as part of the working group, but also with those that had expertise in being able to systematically review existing papers and articles and information around digital mental health technologies. And we've been grateful for the contributions and comments from all of those co-authors. Crucially, we've got here our guidance on digital mental health technology, and we'll obviously be talking about that a little bit further today. We've had a successful AI mental health event that we hosted in London earlier this year, and we are currently writing up a summary paper on that particular event, which we hope to be able to publish. We've also continued to produce newsletters regarding the outputs of the project, and that as a result of those newsletters, we're continuing to make sure that we try and publicise information in various formats. So giving you updates on our conference presentations, media and social media presence as well. And we've had the opportunity to contribute to podcasts, the radio interviews, and also press releases in various sources. We've also had digital mental health technology inquiries that have then led to various communications between developers, researchers, and those interested in understanding how their products qualify and are classified as software as a medical device. And then we've also been able to undertake some post-market surveillance compliance work as a result of this guidance that has enabled manufacturers to understand how they may or may not qualify as software as a medical device with their particular digital mental health technologies. So we've undertaken quite a lot of work. There's more to come, but what we obviously want to do today is to make sure that we're giving you a really good overview of the guidance. Next slide, please. So the outputs that we've got in progress is that we are undertaking the development of a standard, a British standard with BSI on the clinical evaluation of digital mental health technologies across the life cycle. We're looking at the quality of life measures that are used particularly by NICE as their preferred tool for measuring cost effectiveness and how appropriate they are for the use in mental health. We're looking at developing further guidance, particularly around post-market surveillance for digital mental health technologies. And then we're also looking at how the yellow card scheme can be improved for the reporting of adverse events associated with DMHTs. We have proposals to produce reports on significant change and also predetermined change control plans, or PCCPs, for digital mental health technologies, and how that may well inform future guidance in those spaces. And we also have learning, which will be available through an NHS learning platform for healthcare, education and social care professionals, as well as members of the public who are interested in learning more in that particular environment on the regulation and evaluation of technologies, and also more about adverse event detection and reporting. We're working with the Royal College of Psychiatry to collaborate and develop training for psychiatrists, but also we're working with other education providers around how to produce material that is critical for developers and academics to understand what the software as a medical device regulations mean for them if they are thinking about developing a trial for a digital mental health technology. And we're also planning on attending a number of different conferences and workshops throughout the remainder of the year to make sure that we're disseminating the work that we are completing, enhancing the understanding and awareness of this particular work, but also in ensuring that any questions and queries that do come about as a result of any publications are being answered in an open and transparent way as possible. Next slide then, please. So final slide from me before I hand over to Frankie. So as we've already mentioned, and as you know, and you signed up for today, you're here to learn a bit more about the digital mental health technology guidance that was published on the 3rd of February this year. So this guidance is specific to how to characterise and qualify your technology as software as a medical device, and ultimately what its classification is likely to then be. It translates the EU and international principles of device characterization, qualification and classification for digital mental health technologies in the UK. So the guidance is specific to the UK market. And we've received overwhelmingly positive response to this and some constructive feedback, which has led us to making some small edits on the 13th of February, so very quickly after publication. But we are always open to further comments and feedback so that we can make this a very agile document and resource for those that are working within this particular area of speciality. We're committed to providing training to bring the guidance to life and answer any general questions. And really want to make this as usable as possible and make sure that there are clear clarifications about how it should be applied and how the decisions that have been made as a result of this guidance can actually enhance the way that regulation of these particular technologies is enabling safe and effective use of these technologies throughout all pathways of healthcare provision. If you do have a specific question that's related to a digital mental health technology, you may need to complete the device characterization form that's part of the guidance document, and you can email the MHRA at info@mhra.gov.uk. I will now hand over to Frankie, and she will take you through the details of the guidance. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Holly. So as Holly mentioned, the last remaining part of this presentation will be going through the guidance. If you're able to, I'd recommend opening up the guidance as well as we walk through it. It might be useful. So in terms of how we've structured it, we've got an initial section at the start, which is called application of this guidance. And I really do recommend just reading that if you're not aware of the wider regulatory landscape in terms of for the UK, whether using UKCA marks and CE marks. So that's the first initial section. After this section, we've divided up the guidance into device characterization, regulatory qualification, and then regulatory classification. So I'll go through each of these. This first slide is going through the device characterization. And what we mean by this is defining what a product's intended purpose is and what its functionality is. We really emphasize that this is a very important step, which helps with all subsequent steps, such as we're going to talk about a little bit more in this webinar, determining the qualification as software as a medical device, but it's also really important for risk assessment, evidence generation, and then also when a person is trying to identify a product that is useful for them, relevant for them, for what they're intending to want to use it for. So it's a really important step. Fortunately, there's quite a lot of guidance already out there at the moment. So as part of this digital mental health technology guidance, we're pointing towards these really good quality guidance. So there's the MHRA guidance on creating an intended use statement and the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, medical device software considerations for device and risk categorization. So these give a really a good overview of how to define and communicate what a device is doing in a consistent and useful manner. So in this guidance, we point towards these two, and we've also, on the back of that, developed a digital mental health technology device characterization form, which is in the appendix, which, as Holly mentioned, we now ask for any developers or manufacturers who want a determination on their product from the MHRA, they need to complete this form before we will answer their inquiry. It also could be a useful form to be able to communicate your product to other stakeholders, such as NICE and so forth. So if we move to the next slide, please. Thanks very much. So now move on to the qualification question. So one of the important things to mention here first is this is based on the intended purpose. So as I've just spoke about before, it's based on how the device is being characterized, what's intended for and its functionality. And this is based on what's on the labeling, the instructions for use, and also importantly, promotional materials, which includes websites, social media and adverts, and also is what the intended purpose states in the technical documentation. So the next line here is emphasizing that a way a developer or manufacturer can assess what a typical user is understanding their product to be used for. They can check by checking what a typical user is actually using their product in the real time. that's a good way of assessing whether the information is clear to those who are typically trying to use this product. So the figure here is summarising the whole approach of how to determine when a software product qualifies as a software as a medical device. So we've broken it down into two questions. The first one, does the digital mental health technology have a medical purpose? And if it does, then the second question to ask yourself is, does the digital mental health technology have sufficient functionality? If both of these are yes, then as it shows in the diagram, this would show that it's likely software as a medical device. If it's a no, then it's unlikely to be software as a medical device, although I would emphasize to read one of the sections towards the end of the guidance, which talks about accessories, multi-modular products, in terms to determine whether your software is potentially an accessory to a medical device, and therefore it would be covered by the medical device regulations in that way. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So what we've done in the next few pages in the guidance, we've tried to give a great deal loads more detail as to how you can identify when a product does have a medical purpose or not. So in the guidance, if you're following, there's a page there which both details exactly the legal text, both from the UK MDR, EU MDD, and the EU MDR. And then it also gives our sort of interpretation, MHRA guidance on what medical purpose is. And how we've explained that is it's the broad process involved in the management of mental ill health. And we've given some more details about what covers there. In this figure here, we're trying to break down some of the medical device definition, which is in those legal texts, and showing how we're using that to determine whether there's a medical purpose. So we're first looking at a question about, does the digital mental health technology perform a clinical task? And what we mean there is we're pointing to those aspects in the definitions: diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, compensation, and prevention. And then the second question is then looking at, does the digital mental health technology target clinical conditions and symptoms? And this is pointing towards us trying to give further guidance as to what is meant by the term disease, which is the term that's used in the legal text, but might feel quite inappropriate, especially when considering digital mental health technologies. So this figure is a summary overview, and then there's a table 1 and table 2, which gives some more examples. And then we give additional examples onto that. So the important thing to note, it both needs to have a clinical task and be targeting clinical conditions and symptoms for there to be considered to be a medical purpose. So we'll move to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So as I said, there's a lot of detail in the tables, which covers some further tips of what's included there. And then we have some examples. I've just brought out one in particular, which in fact is actually the example that Holly mentioned, that we did one edit quite close after the publication. And we actually found that we got some feedback that the way we had written this hadn't made it entirely clear as to what we were trying to get across. So I thought it'd be a good one for us to bring out in this webinar. So the bit here is it's speaking to the point in table 2 where we've said that if a digital mental health technology doesn't necessarily reference if it's referencing, doesn't necessarily reference in its intended purpose, let's say, for example, a clinical condition such as major depression disorder, but there are other parts of the product and the promotional materials which are inferring that it is being used, it's intended for that use, then in fact we would consider that to be a medical purpose. So just to read out the example. So in this example, we've said that if on the manufacturer's website, it states the product is designed to support individuals to improve their well-being. So in that face, it seems as if it could likely be a well-being product. However, in this example, we're emphasizing that in the manufacturer's social media, that their own social media, that is, it promotes that the product suggests it reduces the risk of developing depression. And also the app is regularly recommended by healthcare professionals in primary care to help those with moderate depression. So in this case, we're saying because of the two latter aspects, that would have an inferred medical purpose, and therefore we're given the two options for a manufacturer here. The first one being that to regulate this product as a medical device and ensure that there is consistent messaging around its intended use and evidence. Or alternatively, they need to remove any emphasis of mental health conditions on social media and elsewhere, and ensure it's not being recommended by healthcare professionals or being used for a medical purpose. So hopefully that gives a little bit of some more flavour as to what we mean by this inferred medical purpose. If we move to the next slide, please. Thanks very much. So as I said in the summary figure for the qualification, there were two questions, the first one being the medical purpose and then the second one being the functionality. So this slide here now is speaking to that functionality question. What we've tried to explain that every digital mental health technology will likely have various different functions, and within those functions there'll be different computational tasks. What we're asking for in terms of the device characterization is to be able to break down what exactly a product is doing in terms of the different functions and tasks. What this figure here is showing is if a particular function only performs the computational tasks which are in this left grey box, so A to D, then this would be considered what we've termed as low functionality. Whereas if it's the function is performing computational tasks which are more than those in the grey box, and for example those in the blue box next door, so the E, F and G, this would be considered to be high functionality. It's important to note that the A to D has come from both what's in our MHRA software guidance already and what's already being used at an EU level. So the EU MedDevs and MDCG guidance talk about a step in determining qualification being checking whether the product is doing and performing anything more than storing data, communicating data, or simple search. So this figure here is trying to clarify how those principles can be used for digital mental health technologies in particular, as we've found there are some particular products, common products in this area where it was people were unsure how to use those spirits of that guidance. So that's what the aim is for here. So just to summarize here, if there's a medical purpose plus a low functionality, so only computational tasks from the left box in the grey, then this would likely not be considered software as a medical device. However, if there's a medical purpose plus high functionality, this would likely be software as a medical device. So we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as you've most probably seen in the guidance, we then go through a vast number of examples for different functionalities. So we've really tried to include as many as we can to try and bring to life what these principles mean. So these are all ones that we have seen come across our desk and have made determinations on as well. So in the interest of time, I won't go through all of those, of course, but we've picked out a couple that we thought might be interesting. So the first one that we picked on to focus on was function 13, which is given the example of the PHQ-9 questionnaire. So it's one that we see often in a digital mental health technology, that there's this function. So we thought it'd be useful for that. And also because in this example here, we're showing how this questionnaire could potentially be presented in a manner that allows you to use the computational task D, which is processing data and information with an easily verifiable calculation and algorithm. So what this means, if I'll go into some more detail with it in the next couple of slides. So if you move to the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So as part of the previous figure 4 that I just showed, there's a note here that gives some extra detail as to the 6 points that need to be met for a function to be able to use the easily verifiable computational task. So for those who are following in the guidance, I recommend having a look at page 20 here, and it goes through the list of 6 points that all need to be met in order to be able to use this. So the first one is the function needs to have information provided to the user about what the tool is intended for and the limitations. So we've given some example of what that may look like for a PHQ-9. This doesn't need to be exactly how a manufacturer or developer puts it, but it's just some ideas. The second point here is information is provided to the user about how the tool has been developed and validated. And again, we've just put some example text there. Thirdly, information is provided to the user about how the tool works, that it is understandable for the intended users. So we've got some text here, and then if we move to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. You can see how it's again an example of how you could present the PHQ-9 so that it's presented in a manner for the user to be able to easily verify. So what this means in this context is the user can easily review the questions, which you can do on this page here, their answers. So we've given a sort of a test show there of examples, how their answers were scored. Again, it's very easy to see that by saying several days with little interest or pleasure of doing things, that would be scored as 1. And then their result, which is at the bottom, and the meaning of their results as shown in the table to the right there. So if this is shown in a manner that is for a typical user would be easy for them to understand, then this can be met. The last couple of points here are the user needs to be signposted for more information. And then most importantly, we do require user studies to have been undertaken as evidence to show that a tool is easily verifiable. So this came up as quite a large discussion point in our working group, who, as Holly mentioned, we closely worked with them to develop this guidance. And there was really this point about we can't have what one person might say they think is easily verifiable, another person might think isn't, and might be vastly different from let's say, for example, patients and public who are using this product. So it's really important that user studies are used to be able to evidence that it is easily verifiable. And on page 20, where I've mentioned before, we do give some added information about the user studies. So it needs to show that there's evidence that a typical user understands the information that detailed in 1 to 5 points that I've gone through. And importantly, they can reliably detect whether a score is incorrect and check it without any additional aids such as calculator, and therefore is easily verifiable for the typical user. And if it's helpful, the rationale behind this is the idea that if a user could identify that, let's say, the software has said that they've got a lot higher PHQ-9 than they actually answered, so there was an issue with the software, that they'd be able to understand or identify that mistake and potentially mitigate any clinical risk that could happen, but by understanding that it was a mistake on the software as opposed to a concern for themselves. So that's the sort of the reason behind it. And again, a couple of other things to mention with the user studies is really being sure about these are for the typical users. So bearing in mind whether it's healthcare professionals or patients or publics, whether it's adults or young people or children who will be using the product. Another important point to make is it's in a typical use environment. So potentially someone might be able to identify an issue if they're given a lot of time to be able to look at it, but potentially a product might be used in a sort of high-pressured clinical environment, and whether a typical healthcare professional will check every single calculation. So they need to the evidence needs to bring out all of those points of how it would be typically used in the use case, if that makes sense. Perfect. So moving on to the next slide, please. So hopefully that's given a bit of an understanding of what we mean by the easily verifiable term. One of the other functionalities that we thought might be good to bring up in the webinar, because we're aware it's quite a hot topic at the moment, is the AI scribes type functions that we're seeing quite a lot. So we've got this down as function 11 here. And as you can see, we've highlighted that in this example, we are considering the function to be both storing data and information without change. And as you may remember from that figure earlier, that would be considered to be low functionality. It's also communicating data and information without change or prioritization. Again, that would be considered low functionality. But really importantly, these products are processing data and information using AI. And as you can see on the right side here, which says what are the software outputs, what we've highlighted here is, in this example, the healthcare professional, it is considered that the healthcare professional will not be having time to verify every summary. So one of the things that is a showing sign of that maybe is if the tool is claiming that it's saving healthcare professional time, then the question to ask yourself is, will a healthcare professional be checking every transcript and checking that the summary is accurate for that transcript? It could be argued that if they are checking every single one, it may no longer be doing the claim of the product of saving any time here. So it's really important to emphasize that if they're not checking every transcript and the summarization, that means it wouldn't be considered easily verifiable. Therefore, it'd be considered to be a high functionality and then software as a medical device. If we move to the next slide, please. I think we've got two more examples that we've brought up here. So function 27, we've given an example about a digital game. And for this one, we're highlighting that in these cases, they'd be considered to be processing user instruction with an interactive and or personalized output, and therefore would be considered high functionality and software as a medical device. And then in this this other example, we've given a virtual reality or augmented reality, mixed reality type product. And again, that'd be similarly, we'd consider that to be processing user instruction with an interactive and or personalized output, and therefore high functionality. So could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is just highlighting what I mentioned before. So if it comes out that your product doesn't have a medical purpose or is low functionality, it's really important to consider how this product is being used in potentially with other software products or hardware products. And it can become quite a complicated landscape for regulation. So we've just tried to pick up some important points that we thought hopefully will be helpful. So as I've mentioned, technologies can be made up of various software modules, where some might qualify as software as a medical device, but others may not. So the first thing that we've emphasised here, that it's a manufacturer's choice as to whether they regulate the digital mental health technologies that qualify software as a medical device as separate products, or if there's many that qualify as software as a medical device and don't, they could still regulate the whole product, all of the modules as one product. The second thing we wanted to point out was that lots of digital mental health technologies may need either non-medical or medical hardware devices in order to work. So if this is not specific, for instance, it's using an off-the-shelf mobile, laptop or VR headset, and the digital mental health technology is placed on the market separately with the IFU noting the general required devices, then the digital mental health technology can be regulated as standalone software. However, if the digital mental health technology needs specific hardware device, for example, a specific brand of VR headset, and that this is placed on the market for this intended purpose, the digital mental health technology and hardware may be considered components of one medical device, accessories to each other, or a system, but most importantly, they need to be regulated together. However, the last point is the big take-home message that although there are a few choices as to how to regulate different accessories or multi-module or interconnected devices, however a manufacturer decides to do this, they need to ensure that there's evidence that the software modules or the software and hardware combinations are safe and perform as intended. And the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So the next few slides will now focus on the classification. So that is considering that you have already gone through, you've characterized your device, you've determined that it does qualify as software as a medical device, you then need to know what is the classification. So as I mentioned before, I do recommend reading the application for this the guidance at the start of the guidance, because this goes through how currently in the UK you can either have a UKCA mark or a CE mark, and for a UKCA mark that will be based on either the EU MDD and the UK MDR, and for a CE mark that will be based on the EU MDR. So that's why you'll see that I'll be now talking about different regulations, and the classification systems are different. It's important most probably to note with this, so it will have an impact as to where you're putting your product on the market. So in Great Britain, you can use the UK CE mark, and we are still accepting CE marks, but for Northern Ireland, you do need that CE mark. And for software products, it's important to mention that currently our app stores are categorizing apps in a UK space. So any product that's being put on the market via some of the app stores, then it is being put on the market for both Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So you do need to ensure that you're both compliant to both the UK MDR and EU MDD, and also the EU MDR. So now this slide here is focusing in on the UK MDR and EU MDD, and the main headline is that most or software products would be a class 1 unless they're driving or influencing a device of a higher classification, and that comes under as implementing rule 2.3, or if they're performing direct diagnosis or monitoring vital physiological signs, which is written about in rule 10. So for those of you who are aware of the MHRA software guidance, you'll have seen this box on the right here, which is a screenshot from this guidance, which gives some more detail about the definition of allowing direct diagnosis. So what we've put in the software guidance is that the product needs to be providing the diagnosis of the disease or a condition by itself, or is providing decisive information for making a diagnosis, or is claiming claims that it can perform as or support the function of a clinician in performing diagnostic tasks. We've also stated here that for devices intended to be used by lay users, provision of an indicative diagnosis may be enough to imply that the device is allowing direct diagnosis. So for this, what we've tried to do in the digital mental health technology guidance is we've given a little bit more information as to what that might mean for digital mental health technology based on some of the products that we've seen come across our desk. So what we've written is it's important to emphasize here that digital mental health technologies that provide the probability of a mental health condition or probability of symptoms highly correlated to mental health conditions, where there is a reliance on this to determine clinical management options, may be considered as providing decisive information, and as such would be considered to be providing direct diagnosis, and as per Rule 10 of the EU MDD, should be regulated as Class 2A medical device. So if we move to the next slide, I believe we've highlighted the example that we put in the guidance here to try and bring that to life a little bit more. So a digital mental health technology that collects information about patients and uses complex algorithms or AI to summarize this information and report probabilities of mental health conditions. And if that product, if healthcare professionals are using that product to rely on the output as decisive information for making an indicative diagnosis and clinical management decisions, including triaging and allocating treatment pathways, then this would be considered to be direct diagnosis, and therefore would need to be a Class 2A. And at the bottom here, we've mentioned that for those cases where it could be quite in the grey area, what we'd like to see is some evidence. If a manufacturer is claiming that it's not performing direct diagnosis, some evidence of what other information healthcare professionals are using, and sort of showing that the product isn't the decisive information. And there's some evidence aspect about it, but there's also the option of being able to design technical solutions within the product itself to show this. So for example, the technology may require the user to know other decisive information used and flag when the healthcare professional has gone against the technology output due to this other decisive information. So this can both be a way to flag to healthcare professionals as a reminder not to decisively use this information in a decisive way, but it also can help collect that evidence as well. Can we move to the next slide, please? So now moving on to the EU MDR. So the rule we are going to highlight in this webinar is Rule 11, which states software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes is classified as a Class 2A or higher. And then the EU MDCG guidance that we've referenced here gives some further clarification as to what that rule means. So they've stated that the wording intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes describes in very general terms the mode of action which is characteristic of all medical device software. Therefore, this sub-rule is generally applicable to all medical device software, excluding those that don't have a medical purpose. And for this reason, we have emphasised in the digital mental health technology guidance that this rule would be generally applicable to all digital mental health technologies that qualify as software as a medical device. Therefore, if your product does qualify as software as a medical device and you're looking at the EU MDR classifications, it will be at least a Class 2A.
Thank you, Frankie. And just summarise our next steps for the project. So what we would like to be able to do is provide a bit of feedback on the webinar in terms of whether or not, we would like to elicit some feedback from you as registrants on the webinar itself, how helpful it's been, being very mindful that this webinar is designed specifically to cover the scope of the digital mental health technology project, the guidance that we've published, and obviously if there were any questions that we were unable to answer that were specific to that topic, then obviously we do apologise, but I think we need to be very clear that the scope of this is very much talking about this particular piece of guidance, and that we hope that actually offering these types of webinars is helpful for you to be able to ask questions specific to guidance that's been published, and have clarifications on any of those kind of details that are particularly helpful to talk to the regulator about as to where that's come from and what that means and applies in practice, and that we hope to be able to deliver some more of these in a very similar format in future as well, to provide some more clarification. So it'd be really helpful if, when you receive the feedback form, if you do have any particular strong feelings or no feelings about that you do complete that feedback form, just to let us know what would be useful for you. As we mentioned, we're embarking on developing a standard around the clinical evaluation of digital mental health technologies. And again, just to reiterate, that's really about making sure there's a consistent application of an approach to how evidence is generated for these technologies, ensuring that there's a clear consideration for lived experience and co-collaboration and co-creation, ethical considerations, mitigation of bias throughout the way in which trials are developed, and how post-market surveillance and evidence generation through the life cycle of the product is really consistently applied. We're looking at the quality of life measures that are used, and particularly those that are used for NICE economic evaluations, and how appropriate they may or may not be for mental health, and how else we can enhance the understanding of what it means for a patient or a user to review the effectiveness of a technology based on their quality of life scores or measures that might be more applicable to them or mean more to them in that context. We are looking at providing some guidance on post-market surveillance for digital mental health technologies. Again, that may be more clarifications of the existing guidance on post-market surveillance and vigilance requirements for SAMD, with nuanced updates for digital mental health specifically, and specific examples of what that might look like in terms of post-market reporting of adverse events. We're looking at improving the way in which the yellow card scheme offers the capability to not only educate users to that page about what actually digital mental health technologies are, and that they can qualify as medical devices, but also making the process for reporting for digital technologies a lot more applicable to those technologies themselves. We're looking at reporting again on the process of significant change, predetermined change control plans for digital mental health technologies, and what it is that we need to consider if we were to be producing particular efforts around some further guidance in that area. As we've already mentioned, there's lots of activity around improving awareness and education for healthcare professionals, social care, education professionals and the public, amongst professional bodies as well, to try and enhance the awareness of regulation and evaluation in this space, and again of adverse event reporting and detection for these particular technologies, and that we'll be attending and events to talk about the work that we're doing, try and enhance stakeholder engagement, and generally just try and promote the work that we're doing so that people are just more aware of the technologies that can be in use in all sorts of settings, and really fly the flag for good, effective regulation and evaluation of these technologies. So very grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk to you in this format today. Welcome your attention for what feels like almost 2 hours now of, and it was definitely nearly 2 hours of what we hope was helpful information, but also responses to those questions that have come through as well. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope to be able to speak to you again in this format sometime in the future. So, and thank you, Frankie, and for the team in being able to put this webinar together. So grateful for everyone's efforts, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you for everyone for attending today's webinar. Following the webinar, you will receive a short survey to capture your views. We really value your feedback, so please take this opportunity to provide your comments. You will also receive a follow-up email in the coming weeks with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of the MHRA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.